And as I've said before, my campaign theme is bold structural change, not just incremental reform. We've talked multiple times about the fact that we face 5 crises: a public health crisis, the pandemic, an economic recession, the budget crisis in Olympia, the climate change crisis, and the demands for racial justice. And accordingly, I have 4 campaign priorities: avoid austerity in the upcoming state budget negotiations. We need a new source of progressive revenue, address climate change with high impact, low cost programs, and address the challenge of racial justice with a focus on societal equity. So structural change, and today, since we're dealing with economic development, that will incorporate sort of the racial justice theme, also the budget crisis and the recession. So this is linked to my overall priorities. Okay, agenda today. We'll talk about the problem of economic development. There's a framework for how I'll discuss addressing that. Talk about policy responses in several categories, and then close with themes. All right, so the first question, how can we promote economic growth in South Seattle? And I want to say something about this, and I want to ask, is this a good question to ask? And that will seem obvious. And yes, it is a good question. It's imperative to implement strategies that will generate economic growth in South Seattle in order to address disparities. So of course it's a good question, but I also want to introduce the following thought, that sometimes it can be a troubling question. And by that I mean, in a lot of areas in the city where economic growth is strong, there's a lot of things that have been put in place over time that don't exist in places that are more impoverished. So there's huge issues of justice here. So it's sort of concerning to tolerate enormous differences in societal well-being based on geography and ethnicity. And then once those inequalities exist, then ask how these discrepancies can be remedied with sort of a Band-Aid approach. So the question's important and it needs to be addressed, but it also can sort of hide huge inequalities that give rise to the economic inequalities. So there needs to be an understanding that these inequalities also need to be addressed in order to promote economic growth. So I'll elaborate on that as we go a little further. So let's talk about some of these inequalities. So this is Seattle City, a map of Seattle. This is Seattle City District number 2. So this, where I'm showing my cursor, this is Seward Park, this is Jefferson Park. I live on Beacon Hill right about here. This is much of the 37th district, but the 37th district also goes further south, and some of Seattle City Council District 2 isn't in the 37th district. This territory here is in the 11th LD, 11th legislative district. But I'm going to show some data that compares this part of the 37th legislative district to the surrounding districts to sort of show the inequalities. And it's easier to do that at a city level than compare the 37th legislative district to other districts, because other districts have such different demographic features. So I'm going to compare this part of the 37th to the other Seattle districts. All right, so Region 2, which is where I am, is compared to West Seattle, central area. We just looked at the map, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and here are the districts right here, 1 through 7. So if we look at demographic profiles, the white percent in Seattle, 29% in where I live, Region 2, but in all the others, it's high 60s, 70s, 80s. So we're a complete anomaly relative to other districts. The percent black, 21 here, more than double the percent of any other district. Percent Asian, triple some districts, but double any of them. Hispanic, tied for first, so a much more ethnically diverse district. And then income. Well, every other district in Seattle has an average income, household income of 80,000, 98,000, that's close to 100, whereas South Seattle, 63,000. So we're considerably lower income than the other districts. Unemployment rate higher than all the other districts, poverty rate higher than the other districts. So we are a standout in terms of, dominated by lower income ethnic minority groups, and it's a low income district. So this sort of, sets the stage for the question of how does one go about addressing this? And it's a, very significant problem. And there's other data that we need to be aware of also. So just a couple facts. Seattle Public Schools, if we look at the percent of students that are on free and reduced lunch by race, African Americans 83%, Caucasians 8%. That's alarming. Seattle schools, what percent of the students in the 8th grade pass the Smarter Balance test, proficiency for math and reading? Well, for white students, it's more than double that. For black students, that's highly concerning. U.S. median incomes by race, huge differences. Incarceration rates, 4 to 5 times the rate of our incarceration for black individuals than white individuals. So huge, disparities within my district, within the city of Seattle. So this theme, this notion of addressing these is huge. And to do this effectively is going to require us to start to address issues of equality, like I talked about before. And what's challenging is that the needs to address equality are juxtaposed with a broader societal reality, which is going the other way. So this shows the share of national income from 1980 to 2015 going to the top 1% of individuals in our country. So it goes from 10 to 20. So, and at the same time, the bottom 50% share of national income is declining. So my point is, I'm advocating for programs that engage in redistribution, but I'm aware that I'm proposing that against the backdrop of a country that's moving in the opposite direction. In my opinion, this is a very alarming graph, and one can elaborate on this just a little bit. For those that wonder how important political leadership is, this is sort of the same chart, but going back from 1910 to 2010. After the Great Depression, FDR is in office, and there's the New Deal, tax reform, Social Security, and inequalities go down, and then that launches, the era of Reagan, and that starts a new era in America, and inequalities start going up. So political leadership is huge. This is one of the most, in my opinion, important explanatory graphs of American society and history in the last century, and these trends continue. Some analysts argue that it's the very fact that once inequalities get really high, it leads to recession. So they argue that once it reached, close to 25%, that led to the Great Depression. 2007 led to the Great Recession. That's a contentious theory, so I'm not going to spend time on it now. But anyway, it is a theory. But the broader point is, I'm going to be arguing for programs that argue for redistribution, and that's against a societal backdrop that's been operating in the opposite direction. Okay, so is there a framework we can use to discuss economic development? And I'll argue yes, and here it is. So I'm arguing that there's sort of 4 broad categories of steps that can be taken to address societal inequalities. The first deals with resource redistribution. And this is very contentious. People have a lot of different views on this. There's many examples, so I'm going to show a chart on this, a chart on this, a chart on this, and a chart on this. But one example would be progressive tax reform. So why is that redistributive? Well, if we have more affluent people pay a higher percentage of taxes, then they pay it, lower income people don't have to pay it. So we're redistributing resources if we engage in this. So we'll talk more about this in a second. Second category, strategic investments. So for example, sound transit. That's not necessarily redistributive because all the regions of Seattle benefit from sound transit, but nevertheless, it does help economic growth. Next, progressive policies such as affirmative action. I'll talk about that. Not necessarily totally redistributive, although in a way they are, but there's a set of policies here. And then finally, organizations that are involved in building the community. These are an underappreciated source of stability and economic growth. Even things like community centers, the Ethiopian Community Center, Filipino Community Center, other organizations that help build sort of social bonds. They help with before school programs, after school programs. This helps with students staying in school, getting their homework done, graduating, etc. So these are called civil society organizations, and they also support economic growth. So 4 categories, I'll talk more about them. But back to one of the themes that I talked about earlier, some of these get at structural change. Redistributing resources changes the structure of society. Others represent incremental improvements, and both sets are important, okay? So with that, I'm going to start here and then just move from one to one, from left to right as we go. So starting with, no, actually I have one chart first. And this gets at the complexity of what we're trying to do with economic development. So what are some of the objectives? Well, we want economic security for more financial stability, less homelessness, more consumer spending, etc. We want more jobs, greater career opportunity, higher wages, more community cohesion, more family stability, less crime, greater public investment in the community, more businesses located in the community. And the point that I want to make here is economic development is multifaceted. It can be symbiotic. And we want to develop a virtuous circle, the opposite of a vicious cycle where things are coming together to cause things to continually get better. So for example, let's say starting here, there's investments in parks in a community. Well, that might lead businesses to locate in the community. Maybe Starbucks builds a few more stores in Southeast Seattle. Well, that leads to more jobs. And when there's more employment, then wages go up. Now people are doing better. Perhaps they start to be able to afford more educational opportunities. This leads to more family stability, less crime. This leads to more economic security, more consumer spending. So we can start to engage in a virtuous circle where a number of things are coming together to cause economic growth. So it makes the point that there's not a silver bullet for economic growth. Instead, there's many things that need to happen concurrently. And that also makes the point at the bottom that it's important to have a unified vision, a unified strategy. One doesn't want to go about this in a piecemeal manner, but rather by trying to integrate various things to have multiple things happening in an integrated, well thought out manner for economic development. Okay, so now briefly I'm going to go through each of these 4 categories, and we will start with redistributive policies. So there's many here, and I'm not going to go through them all, of course. Some relate to taxation. So if we can, the green ones, by the way, are ones I am going to spend just a few seconds talking about in a little bit more detail. But there's lots, by making tax more progressive, we redistribute resources from affluent people to people that need them. They then have more money to spend. More consumer spending leads to economic growth, hiring, etc. Wages, ongoing increases to the minimum wage helps. Universal health care, there's things in zoning which we've talked about before. So for example, the HALA program, if we let developers build more, we then require them to set aside a certain number of units for affordable housing, etc. So there's all the social safety net, welfare, foster care that redistributes resources to poor people to help them create stability, which leads to more family stability, more disposable income, etc. So there's lots of different areas that redistribute resources that are beneficial. I'm just going to talk about a couple in more detail. Subsidized daycare. With the pandemic, a lot of schools will not be reopening, and so kids will be at home. And that means for lower income families where there's people that might otherwise be able to work, they have to take care of their kids. So subsidized daycare becomes an important lever to promote economic growth. Similarly, unemployment benefits from the federal government are about to expire. It's important for those to be reinstated to enable people, to not be evicted, et cetera, which is terrible for economic growth. Job training goes without saying. I'm going to talk about two more and then we'll look at them in a little detail. I'm going to talk about community investment schools in a minute. There's also a program in Seattle called the Seattle Promise Program, which offers 2 years of free college for anybody. I argue, and I stand for this position, that this shouldn't be for everybody. It should only be needs-based. So only for people that don't have the financial means to afford it. Otherwise, it becomes sort of a wealth transfer mechanism to more affluent people. They can already afford it, and yet we're subsidizing college, and it's generally a higher percent of more affluent families send their kids to college than lower income kids. So even though it sounds progressive, it really is sort of another mechanism that transfers opportunity more so to affluent people. The Washington College Grant is a program that provides financial assistance to all high school students in need, which is a good program. Okay, so a couple comments on education and taxation. I'll talk more about that, about the importance of becoming more progressive in Washington State. So I'll start with education, and here's an important chart. So I gathered this data from a couple different sources. This shows the high schools in Seattle, all of them. The ones in purple are high schools in South Seattle, and the ones in green are high schools in North Seattle. As you know, I worked as a substitute teacher for 15 years. I've worked at all these schools many times. And it correlates the percent of students on free and reduced lunches on the horizontal axis. So Rainier Beach has 65% of its kids on free and reduced lunches, compared to Roosevelt with 9%. And it looks at the average SAT score compared to the state average. The state average is 1067, so Roosevelt operates at 140 points higher than that, so about 1,200. Rainier Beach at 200 points below that, so 867. So huge differences in average SAT scores between these schools. And the point that this chart is making, of course, is that when we have a high percent of students on free and reduced lunches, it creates enormous educational challenges, all of which I've seen by working in these schools, that don't exist in the more affluent schools. That shows up in less disciplinary problems, more resources, more kids participating in music programs. All of these things contribute to, differential outcomes. Is it more complicated than this? Of course it is. But is this a big factor? And of course it is. And so a question that I'm going to ask in talking about economic development, does this lead to differences in economic opportunity? Of course it does. Higher SAT scores and grades lead to more college opportunities and employment opportunities. So if, as a society, we have to ask, are we going to tolerate this year in, year out? And I'm going to argue that we shouldn't, but that's very controversial. So what proposal am I making? I'm making the following proposal. I'm calling it community investment schools. So school districts would operate with 2 tiers of schools within the same districts, normal schools and community investment schools. And a community investment status would be triggered by statistical thresholds. So if once a school has an overly high percent of free and reduced lunch students, it would qualify to become a community investment school. And here's the key. It would receive significantly higher per pupil investment than normal schools. So Rainier Beach would start receiving higher per pupil funding than Roosevelt. And Roosevelt would get lower funding, Rainier Beach higher. That would be very, very controversial because the families, of course, in the Roosevelt district aren't going to want that to happen in general. So what I'm advocating is for more premium pay for teachers and administrators, lower class sizes, more counselors, and the introduction of AP and international baccalaureate programs. And this community investment schools would make the statement, we're not going to tolerate huge differences in schools based on socioeconomic differences. We already allocate more money per pupil to schools with a high percent of English language learners and special education students. I'm just advocating for a third factor, free and reduced lunch intensity. So this is a redistributive program, certainly would be controversial, but it certainly can be done. And programs like this have been instituted in various places around the country. So that's a proposal. Yes, it's controversial. I understand that. Next, taxation, another redistributive program. This shows the percent of the income paid in taxes by the state's lowest 20% of earners. U.S. average 11.4%, and in Washington 17.8%. We've talked about this before. We have our lowest income residents pay a very high percentage of their income in taxes. It's because we don't have an income tax. And this is not trivial. So let's take a minimum wage earner in Seattle who earns $15 an hour. That translates to $30,000 a year. And if they pay the 17.8%, which they do, that's over $5,000 in taxes, just state and local, doesn't include federal taxes. And if they were paying the state, the national average, it would only be $3,360. So we're having our low income residents pay $2,000 a year more in taxes than they should if we were just operating according to the national average. So we would have Bill Gates be paying the difference here rather than our poor people. And this is especially important for the 37th LD that I represent. So I have an education redistributive proposal, community investment schools, and a taxation proposal, more progressive taxation. We've talked about, I'm just going to briefly touch on this slide. This shows how much we taxed relative to other states over time in Washington state. So back in 1990, this is the U.S. average, state and local taxes as a percent of personal income. We used to be a high tax state, charging up to 8% more than the average of the other states. And over time, we became a low tax state to the point where in 2015, we were 10% below the average of other states. This is due to Tim Eyman initiatives to cap taxes, the limit on property taxes that they can't go up by more than 1% a year, coupled with other states instituting new taxes when we didn't. So we went from a high tax state to a low tax state over a couple decades. And the important thing to think about is this has implications for lower incomes individuals. When you become a lower tax state, that hurts things like funding for foster care, welfare, etc. And so we hurt the lower income individuals both by taxing less, but then also who pays the taxes? We have the lower income people pay a higher percentage of those taxes. So they get hurt in multiple ways. Okay, so taxation and education. There is a proposal this year by another legislator, Frank Chop, that involves 3 new taxes: capital gains, payroll, and a tax on high income earners. I support this, and it deals with all 3 problems. We have higher taxation, which is good for the social safety net. It will enable us to deal with the budget deficit that's pending in Olympia, and it will address the regressivity problem. So this is his proposal that I'm backing to deal with the revenue problem. Okay, on to the second category, strategic investment. So you'll recall we looked at this chart. We just talked about resource redistribution. Now we'll talk about strategic investment. And that's here. Again, lots of things we can do. So we're making investments in things like parks, libraries, infrastructure investment, sound transit. And then 2 I'll talk about just for a minute, internet as a public utility and the Green New Deal programs like retrofitting buildings with clean energy programs. The reason they're all beneficial for jobs, sound transit, etc. But things like the internet provide a second order benefit that not only are there jobs available, but you're also making the internet available to everybody, which has equity implications for education, healthcare, etc. Also for the Green New Deal, when you retrofit homes, you provide jobs, but you're also supporting climate change, so progress. So some of these investments have second order benefits. There's all sorts of loan programs available to lower income businesses from the Small Business Administration, et cetera. Those need to be taken advantage of. There's opportunity zones. These were created under the Trump administration to provide tax incentives for lower income areas. A lot of these areas are in my district. There has been some corruption where some developers work to get an area designated as an opportunity zone so that once they build a casino, then they can get benefits. But there's also a lot of zones where this is working well, including in my district. And there are organizations that, for example, get involved in purchasing underutilized land, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Once again, a whole host of things that can be done. There's no silver bullet for economic growth. All right, and I talked about a group involved in land purchases to repurpose land for economic benefits in the district. This is an organization called King County Equity Now. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but one of the things they do is they look to maximize the use of underutilized land. So for example, there's a decommissioned fire station on 23rd and Yesler in my district. They're trying to repurpose that to turn it into a center for enterprise to support youth training. So they're also involved in halting predatory development, for example, Yesler Terrace. So the point is, within the category of strategic investments, there are local groups working on strategic investments within my district, which I, of course, support. Third category are progressive policies. And again, there's many. Policing policy, gun control helps violence, which keeps people out of hospitals and working. That's good for economic growth. Voting outreach is good for economic growth. Healthcare improvements are good for economic growth. Education policies, etc. So there's many, many things. I'm just going to talk about a few. Affirmative action is important. There's a measure in the legislature to support that this year, I 1076, which I support. Unions, which are on decline in the country, the decline in unions hurts collective bargaining, which leads to lower wages for workers, which is one of the factors behind the earlier charts that I showed that shows income inequality increasing. So I'm a member of a union and pro-union. There are also laws that require, for example, when Sound Transit builds in South Seattle, that they have to use local laborers. They can't bring in outside work crews, and they need to pay the prevailing wages that are being paid in other districts. They can't take advantage of the lower compensation levels in South Seattle. So I support that. Criminal justice is an underappreciated dimension of economic growth. So we have diversion courts. And what does that mean? Let's say that I get charged with a minor drug crime. Let's say the possession of cocaine, for example. Well, if I go to prison for some period of time, that hurts my economic opportunity. That will damage my family. And that will lead to less spending and damage economic growth. There are things called diversion courts, where instead of going to prison, I go to a court and they work to provide, counseling and support to keep me out of jail, provided I don't recommit the same crime. That enables me to take care of my family, et cetera, and contribute to economic growth. Similarly, investments in prison rehabilitation, reentry programs, and parole help ex-prisoners get reestablished in the job market, which is also good for economic growth. So ironically, this is an area where the most conservative groups in America, like the Koch brothers, and the most liberal groups in America see things, they have the same objective. The Koch brothers want people out of prison to not hurt the economy, and progressives tend to want people out of prison because they think it's the more ethical approach to treating people. But anyway, it's important for economic growth. So again, that's the third category, progressive policy. The fourth category are these civil society organizations that help create bonds, that help with student growth, youth development, good habits, good work, performance at schools, which has implications for college attendance, et cetera. YMCA, chambers of commerce, community centers, et cetera. Tabor 100 and the Office of Minority and Women's Business Enterprises are organizations that help businesses get established, civic organizations. So these are underappreciated as sort of the glue of society that holds the community together, that supports it. And that's very important for economic growth as well. So just sort of, quickly summarizing, there's resource redistribution policies and programs. I've talked about two, the community investment schools and the progressive tax reform. There's strategic investment, sound transit, parks, etc., progressive policies, affirmative action, etc., and civil society. All of these work together, and as we've talked about, there's 50 or there's even more than that within each of these categories. So economic development is complicated, and it's kind of a mosaic with all sorts of different facets from different realms. Some dealing with structural inequalities and some making incremental improvements, but all coming together to form an environment where economic growth is important. So it's very complicated facet. So themes, last two slides. I apologize for going a few minutes over. Economic development is a critical challenge for my district, which you saw. We have a, average family income more than $20,000 a year, lower than other districts. And I'm arguing we can't tolerate this year over year. There needs to be progress on the redistribution front. And we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot, which is what we're doing with regressive taxation. That's just insane. There's not a magic solution. It requires, economic development requires simultaneous progress on many fronts. And it's important to ask the correct questions. To promote economic development, one needs to address the underlying inequalities, I'm arguing. Structural changes are more important than gimmicks. So for example, Seattle Public Schools operates a program, that provides assistance to kids in need to help them with their studies. I'm 100% in favor of that, but yet I don't think that's nearly as important as addressing this, the free and reduced lunch percentages between schools. If all you're doing is providing a little bit of help, which I'm all in favor of, you're not getting at the root of the problem. And I think in order to make important progress, one does need to get to the root of the problem. I've talked about economic development can also support other societal objectives. The internet can support telemedicine, educational equity, etc., and green climate change or building retrofits can support climate change. And then there's this notion that this must be integrated. You don't want you don't want the city of Seattle working on one set of things, King County working on another that are sort of working at cross purposes, and the state of Washington operating at yet another set of programs. This needs to be integrated. So economic development needs to integrate the various decision makers. And finally, my last slide are my priorities. There's many of the programs that I showed that I support, but these would be my top priorities. The K-12 education, the community investment schools, very controversial. That would be hard to enact politically, but I think it's worth trying. Needs 2 years of free community college in Washington State, but only for those in need. Tax reform, which I've talked about, expanding the safety net, which I support. That requires new taxation, and I support the Frank Chop proposal. Subsidized daycare, which is very important during the pandemic when schools will be closed in a lot of areas. Infrastructure investment, sound transit, internet as a public utility, transit-oriented development, building retrofits and home retrofits to support both economic growth and the Green New Deal. Affirmative action program, I said 1076, I'm sorry, it's 1776 in the upcoming legislative session. Local content and prevailing wage requirements, criminal justice system reforms, and also rehabilitation and reentry to keep people out of prison and keep people who are in prison constantly being helped and trained so that they're more able to reenter the workforce later. A vibrant civil society, various community organizations working to repurpose underutilized land. And I do favor when well-crafted tax-advantaged enterprise zones. So very complicated, a lot of material as usual. to do a really good job on this would require, you know, a full-time set of classes for a year, not a 35-minute discussion on Zoom. It's just sort of an introduction to introduce the complexity of the topic and also just to briefly discuss my priorities. So thank you for listening. And with that, Matthew's going to see if anyone has any questions, and we'll do that. Go ahead.